It is with great pleasure that I introduce this next segment because it involves one of my favorite families, Janet, Calvin, and Grant Hill. Janet is one of my personal mentors, and while she is not with us today, her influence and her spirit is always with the men in her family. But the men are here, so let me introduce them to you. Let me start with Dad. So Calvin Hill was selected by the Dallas Cowboys when he graduated from Yale. He became the first Cowboy to rush for 1,000 yards in a season. He was selected for 4 Pro Bowls during a 12-year career. Now that's the football side of the family. Let me go over to the basketball side of the family. There is Grant, a fellow Dookie. When he graduated from college, though, he was drafted by the Detroit Pistons, played 19 years in the NBA, and he is now a Hall of Famer, being inducted just recently. Equally as important, he is a businessman. He's part of the ownership group that owns the Atlanta Hawks, and he co-hosts NBA Inside Stuff. It doesn't stop there. He's a husband and a father, my brother from another mother. So please allow me to introduce Calvin and Grant Hill. They're going to talk about sports, race, and empowerment for the next 20 minutes. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Wow, that was a very credible introduction. So kind of you. I was surprised, so thank you, Lisa. And certainly thank you, John Hope Bryant, and the entire Operation Hope family and team for the incredible work and for the opportunity for my dad and I to have a discussion. So Dad, are you ready?
I am ready. I'm ready when you are.
All right. Well, I think we all can recognize that we are living in some unprecedented times. And some people like to say it's the equivalent of the 1918 Spanish flu, the 1930s Great Depression, and of course the 60s social and civil unrest. And as we sort of analyze where we are today as a society, I'm curious, Dad, your thoughts and perspectives on the impact of sports on the nation's conversation as it relates to race, social justice, and economic disparity.
Well, I think, it's interesting. I think sports has always been, a place where people could look and have hope and where you could find role models. I think back to even in the 50s when I was growing up as a kid, people like Jackie Robinson, and being from Baltimore, Jim Parker, and they were role models for me as a young kid. My father, who had no education, who had come up in the Great Migration from the South, he believed in education, and so he pointed me to people like Jackie Robinson, who had graduated from UCLA, like Jim Parker, who had graduated from Ohio State, and he didn't necessarily focused so much on the fact that they were playing professional sports as he did the fact that they had gotten an education, that they had gone to college. He thought education was the key, and he pointed to sports figures. And then if you look into the 60s, Jackie Robinson, you had Muhammad Ali, people who, were role models in a lot of ways. And now, I look today with social media and all the attention to sports figures. I look at what has happened the last year in professional sports, in my sport, with football and basketball. I mean, basketball certainly has been a leader in terms of focusing on all the things that are happening in this country. And I just think sports can always provide leadership. And people will follow sports. Obviously, you look at yourself or you look at somebody like Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, people want to be like Mike. And so he has a great, voice to lead people.
Dad, that's interesting. I do want to say I'm having some technical difficulties. I can't quite hear exactly what you're saying. But I will chime in on that topic as well. I do think I'm proud of the world of sports and the role that they're playing, and in particular the role and use of technology and social media. I know you and I have talked about this a lot, but social media has been such a fantastic tool. It provides the ability to access information and to be aware of what's happening. I knew it was a game changer in 2011 when Osama bin Laden was found and captured and killed. And instead of hearing about it by Dan Rather or Tom Brokaw, I saw it on Twitter. And so right then and there, I knew the world was changing and the access to information. So the ability to find what's happening, not just in your own community, but all over the world and all over the country, I think is important. But then also the ability to speak directly to your audience. I thought when Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012 in Florida, I thought players began to find their voice and understand they had a platform, had the ability to speak directly to an audience and to the entire world. And that voice has only grown over the last 8 years. And actually, you know, it all sort of this summer came to a head, and you see it in all different sports. So as someone who's a part of that community, I'm certainly proud of the leadership and in the spotlight that's being shined by athletes on some of these very important issues. Of course, Dad, I know you talked a little bit about the role of mentors, and certainly in your own life. I'm just curious, the role of a mentor, role of role models in your sports career, but also in your post-playing career. What has that been like, and how important was that for you in both worlds, if you will?
Well, very important. When I was 10 years old, I went to a father-son banquet, and my dad had been trying to encourage me to think about college. At that point, everybody in my neighborhood worked in the steel mills, and that's what I wanted to do. And I went to a father-son banquet, and Lenny Moore spoke. Lenny Moore was an old player for the Baltimore Colts who had gone to attended Penn State. And while he was at Penn State, he told the story of having a key to the residence of the president of Penn State, who at the time was Milton Eisenhower. And Milton Eisenhower, as ancient history, was the brother of Dwight Eisenhower, the then president. And that made a distinct impression on me, the fact that this guy had a key to the house of the president of Penn State, who was the brother of the president of the United States. And so afterwards, my father took me up to him and said, I want you to meet my son, and I want him to go to college. And Lenny Moore looked at me. He said, son, you ought to do what your father says and go to college. And so that was the moment I decided that I really wanted to go to college. And, my father forced me to look to people like Lenny Moore, and I mentioned Jim Parker. When I went to Dallas as a first round draft choice, one of the things I tried to do was to attach myself to a guy named Pettis Norman. Not very many people would know who Pettis Norman is, but he was a teammate, but he was also the vice president of a bank. And as I looked around at my teammates, I realized this was a guy that I wanted to be like. And so that's when I started to get some financial literacy, talking to Pettis and trying to be like Pettis. And, we didn't have social media, at that point in my life. But, when you look at what you guys are doing now, what you are doing, what LeBron James is doing, what other players are doing in the NBA, what players are doing, I look at Emmitt Smith in Dallas. And they are setting an example, and that example is much wider now. That people can push on their phones, and I'm not as competent as people of your generation, but they can figure out what is Grant Hill doing after football? What is he doing while he's playing? What is LeBron James doing? They can push in and not just watch Michael Jordan make dunk shots, but what is he doing? And look at those guys as role models and try to emulate them.
Yeah, you make a great point. I mean, I think having role models, mentors is so important. And I think for me in my career, as a little kid, obviously my parents, you and mom, were the the most important role models. But outside of that, in sports, I mean, I think of Michael Jackson, not the late singer, but the basketball player who was from our hometown, Reston, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. He went on from our high school to Georgetown and played in the NBA. And so just sort of seeing someone who had done that and knowing that that was a possibility certainly motivated and inspired me at a very early age that, hey, maybe possibly if things, if I'm fortunate, could happen as well. But I think also, too, because of you and your career and the exposure that you and Mom provided, one of the things as I was in college and eventually on in the NBA, having role models who were former athletes who transitioned and pivoted and found careers and found really fulfillment after their playing days. And I think of, people like Junior Bridgman, Dave Bing, who was a legendary Hall of Fame basketball player, had a steel company, auto parts in Detroit when I played in Detroit, eventually became the mayor of Detroit. And so knowing that was a possibility. Also, too, Roger Staubach, who was a teammate of yours, was in your wedding. And according to urban lore, he's responsible for my name. I was nameless for a few days until he made the suggestion of Grant. But certainly his post-playing career and how he was hugely successful as, in commercial real estate with the Staubach Company. So having those, either mentors, having those role models, having those examples, and as you said, people that I knew, people that I could have relationships with, but also people from afar who I can mold and pattern my life after. I think that's so important, and particularly nowadays with the access to information, you can read up and learn about anyone out there for the most part. And so that's huge, and certainly I think we both have benefited greatly. One of the things that I've gone through over the last 7 years is sort of transitioning from playing on the court into now, into the rest of my life. And, I think one of the things that I didn't realize, and I feel like I've made a pretty solid transition and done a pretty good job, but playing 19 years, in professional sports, really my entire adult life devoted to my career as a basketball player. I think most athletes, your career consumes you. You work so hard 24/7 to get to that point where you have the privilege of being a professional athlete. And then you work so hard to maintain that and to try to play as long as you can. And you have a short window. I was fortunate to play till I was 40, and most maybe aren't that fortunate. But now all of a sudden you have to pivot and you have to switch, and now you have to move into a different direction. And so I've done some amazing things I've been so grateful and fortunate of. But I'm just curious for you, going back to the early 80s, what was that transition like for you, going from 13 years in the NFL to now moving forward and trying to look for a sense of purpose and a sense of fulfillment with your life?
Well, it's interesting because when I played, typically, you had an off-season job. We didn't make the kind of money that players today make. And so typically we worked in the off-season, and we got a taste of the real world. And so every year, I did something. I worked in industrial relations for a steel company. I worked for a bank. I was a vice president at a bank in Dallas. I worked every off season. So when it was over, I'd had a taste of the real world and, was ready to go into the real world. As it turned out, I was asked to work for, I was invited to work as a consultant with the Cleveland Browns. And one of the things we focused on, in fact, we were the first team really to do it, was to set up what's now called, player engagement, in the National Football League. A lot of teams have what they call player programs, and it's a bunch of programs that we have put together to help players make that transition, to help players understand that, in addition to being athletes, they should start to think in terms of being responsible in other areas. Financial management. We set up internships, et cetera. We did it initially with the Cleveland Browns, and I like to think that that was the model that all the sports now have to help players make responsible decisions off the field, to make responsible decisions after their careers are over. In sports, you have lots of coaches who can tell you how to run and jump and catch and hit and pitch and do all the things that one has to do to be successful on the field. Now teams are putting together coaches who can help players make that transition once their careers are over or during the off season to make sure that they leverage that platform. And every team now has somebody helping players do that.
Dad, it was interesting. I mean, obviously I was a young kid, and when you made that transition and was aware, obviously, of the work that you were doing with the Cleveland Browns, as you termed it, player engagement. And then many years later, I think it was 2005, I was playing in Orlando, and the head of player engagement for the Orlando Magic mentioned that you were sort of a pioneer in this space, and you were sort of the first with the work that you did in Cleveland, and then later on with the Baltimore Orioles, and then later with the Cowboys. And so I didn't realize just how this whole industry didn't exist. Now I take for granted every professional sports team, or at least the major sports teams, have a player program, player engagement department really working on the very things that you touched on. So that's important. But I want to get back to what you said earlier. You said you had jobs in the off season, which sounds incredibly foreign to players now because of the extremes amount of money that players make. And I'm just curious, that one job, you said you were vice president of a bank. And I'm just, as a young athlete out of college, that kind of experience working around money, I mean, what kind of impact did that have on you at that particular point in your life?
Well, it's very interesting. I was asked to come on board, and it was an opportunity to try to figure out, I was making not the kind of money you made, but I was making more money than I ever thought I would make. But it was handicapping. I didn't know what to do. And so when I went into this bank, when I joined the bank, it was called Dallas Bank and Trust. It's been absorbed by a much bigger bank now. But I wanted to know, how to deal with money. And I was very curious, how did people leverage, I was curious about finance. I was curious about leverage. I wanted to know, how a certain person could start with nothing and end up a millionaire. And so I spent a lot of time talking to people who were on the loan committees and looking at loan portfolios, trying to figure out, and meeting some of our customers and trying to figure out how they had achieved financial literacy and leverage that to where they were stable financially and in some cases very wealthy. I mean, making money doesn't mean you necessarily know how to use it. There's an English expression, pray that a person does not enjoy success before they can endure success. And one of the things I found making a lot of money or more money than I should be making as a 21-year-old person, suddenly I had all kinds of problems. I had this money, didn't know what to do with it. I had a bunch of people coming to me with all kinds of ideas about what they thought I should do with it. And I didn't know. And so I wanted to go and find out. And I felt the best place to do that was to go to a place where, it was a business of money. I went to a bank, a financial institution. And it was very interesting, fascinating for me.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I'll close with this. I mean, I think that was obviously impactful for you and certainly passed along to me. I vividly remember my 18th birthday. I was a freshman in college at Duke, and you had come down and took me and a bunch of my teammates at the time to dinner to celebrate. And during the course of dinner and our conversation, we started talking about hypotheticals. What would you do with $1 million? And certainly $1 million was a lot of money back then, and it certainly is today. And I remember, I thought I was being responsible with my answer. I said, well, I'll spend half of it, and then the other half I'll put in the bank and live off the interest. And then you said, well, what about paying taxes? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so, on one hand, it goes to show sort of where my head was at that particular point at 18. But I have learned a great deal since then, and certainly have a great deal to thank you and Mom for your help and certainly willingness to share and force me to be disciplined about my money. I think one of the things that athletes suffer with is you spend an incredible amount of time at the grassroots level perfecting your craft. And that's even more the case nowadays when you're a teenager in college. And so you never really have a job. You've never really balanced a checkbook. You've never really had that experience. And so all of a sudden you're thrusted into a position where you're making more money than you can ever imagine. And you don't really have that experience in education. And so I know I'm grateful for you and Mom and the various others, role models, advisors along the way. But anyway, Dad, this has been fantastic. I feel like we're at the kitchen table having a discussion, just sharing it with everyone here in the Hope Global Forum. But I want to thank you, Dad, for doing this. Certainly, I'm honored and privileged and thankful. Thank you to my good friend, John Hope Bryant. And we enjoyed this conversation and sharing with all of you.